So let's talk a little more about what light is and how it becomes that proximal stimulus we talked about that we perceive. Light is energy formed by the oscillation of electrically charged material. It travels in waves, which are measured in nanometers. 1 nanometer is the equivalent of 1 billionth of a meter, so very short. We are actually blind to most of it. Humans are able to see the tiny portion of the electromagnetic spectrum referred to as the visible spectrum, ranging from 400 to 700 nanometers. Neighboring this visible spectrum are the shorter ultraviolet rays and the longer infrared rays. There are stories of how during World War II, the US Navy wanted their sailors to be able to see infrared signals that the enemy wouldn't be able to see. So they were fed diets rich in forms of vitamin A to enhance their ability to see into that infrared part of the spectrum. So even though most of us are limited to the visible spectrum, our eyes are able to distinguish the different wavelengths of light within that part of the spectrum. Different wavelengths correspond to the various colors we perceive. So, for example, we perceive light of about 550 nanometers as green, 400 nanometers as purple, and so on. We will discuss color vision in depth later on in the course. So, why this range as the visible spectrum for humans and not other portions of the electromagnetic spectrum? Well, it is believed that eyes first evolved in animals living in water, and the visible spectrum happens to be the range of light that penetrates seawater. The visible spectrums of most other animals are also pretty close to this same range. Light waves have two parameters relevant to vision: wavelength and intensity. Intensity relates to the amplitude of the wave. In other words, how much light is there? Wavelength is the distance light travels to complete one full wave cycle. As we were just talking about, wavelength relates to the color or hue of the light. This wave here has a particular amplitude or intensity and a certain wavelength. Here we have another wave. This new wave has a slightly reduced amplitude and may appear darker, and also has a shorter wavelength. It completes almost 2 full cycles in the same distance as the first wave completed in one. I also colored these two waves differently to demonstrate how light that our brains perceive as red, for example, has a longer wavelength than light that we perceive as purple. The human visual system is extremely sensitive to light. A photon is the smallest possible unit of light energy you can have, and the human visual system can detect light of only about 4 to 5 photons. This is equivalent to standing on a mountaintop and seeing a candle light 30 miles away, which is quite impressive. One type of receptor in our eyes, the cone receptor, will change its rate of activity with just a single photon of light. Our eyes can handle about 10 to the 12th times the threshold of 4 to 5 photons without damage. Beyond that, we would begin to damage our eyes. Eyes don't leave very good fossil records, so it's difficult to tell exactly how the eye evolved. The primary purpose of the eye, the reason for its existence, seems to be to tell us how much light there is and where that light is coming from. It's believed that the eye began with the development of a photosensitive pigment on the skin of an organism such as a flatworm, a sort of hot spot. Over time, that spot became a concavity and could start to provide information about not only the presence of light, but also its direction. Eventually, a clear surface came to cover the concavity, which would be the lens that we have today. There are two main types of eyes. One is the compound eye, which is what most insects have. Compound eyes consist of thousands of individual photoreceptor tubes that are located on a convex surface. And because of the convex surface, they all point in slightly different directions. This allows them to detect how much light is in one direction, which is especially suited for the rapid detection of movement. It also gives them a very large view angle. So why don't we have compound eyes? Well, we would need one tube for each receptor, and we have 126 million receptors in each eye. This would result in our eyes being about 1 meter in diameter. They would basically take up our whole heads and then some. Fortunately, we have what is called the lens, or vertebrate eye. It's a much more complicated eye, but it provides a solution for the large compound eye. It is believed the lens eye developed independently in mammals, fish, and birds. So why have a lens on an eye? What does it do? Well, if the eye were like a pinhole camera, which some animals do have eyes like pinhole cameras, only one ray of light would get through. It would be easy to tell which direction light came from, but not much light would get through. There's not enough light in the world for pinhole camera-like eyes to be very efficient, so we have a bigger opening called a pupil. This allows much more light into the eye. But now we have the problem of a big circle of light projected onto the back of the eye, which would result in blurry vision. So we have a lens over our eye called the cornea. The cornea bends light so that it comes to a point on the retina in the back of the eye, making vision more sharp and focused. However, we actually have two lenses in each eye. Why two lenses? The reason for this is because the cornea only bends light to a fixed degree. If the light source were too close to us, then the light would come to a point that would be beyond the back of the eye. If the light source were too far away, then it would come to a point before reaching the back of the eye. In both of those cases, the image would still be blurry. So we have a second lens called simply the lens, which is flexible and changes its curvature depending on the distance of the light source. So adjusting the point of focus so that it lands directly on the back of the eye. When we are looking at something that is far away, the lens is thinner or less curved. When we are focusing on something that is close up, the lens becomes thicker and more curved. So the cornea is a fixed lens that bends light the same amount. It focuses about 80% of the light coming into the eye. The lens, on the other hand, changes its curvature to focus on near or far objects. This is called accommodation and results in the other 20% of the focusing of light by the eye. So without the cornea, we wouldn't really be able to see anything. Without the lens, we just wouldn't be able to see objects close up very well. As we all know, oftentimes the cornea isn't shaped perfectly and doesn't focus light as well as it could, resulting in us needing glasses or contacts. Myopia, or nearsightedness, occurs when light from distant objects comes into focus in front of the retina, resulting in blurry vision. The furthest point in which objects are still in focus is called the far point. Vision is blurred beyond this far point. A corrective lens bends light so that it enters the eye at the same angle as light coming from the far point. In other words, the corrective lens basically extends the far point. Here, you can see that if a person's myopia is really bad, that person's far point is going to be much closer to the eye than a person whose myopia is less severe. For the more severe myopia, it takes a thicker lens to extend the far point even further. On the other hand, hyperopia, or farsightedness, occurs when light comes into focus behind the retina. People with hyperopia are usually fine seeing distant objects in focus because they accommodate with their lens enough to bring that distant object into focus. However, hyperopia can cause eye strain as objects are brought closer because of the increased need for accommodation by the lens. In this case, a corrective lens is needed to bring the light into focus sooner rather than behind the eye. In the next lesson, we will get into more of these conditions of the eye.